Hi, guys. So today I'm going to be arguing that U.S. attacks on Venezuelan boats were actually legal under international law. So while he has raised concerns about self defense and um humanitarian law, the careful analysis shows that these attacks were conducted within the bounds of recognized legal principles. So, the question of self defense, he suggests that self defense is inconsistently applied and therefore invalid. But under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, a state has the right to defend itself against imminent threats, even preemptively, when there is a clear evidence of danger. So, in the case of these Venezuelan boats, the US government determined that they were transporting large quantities of narcotics directly into US territory. International law recognizes the drug trafficking can constitute to a threat of national security. So, because it fuels organized crime, violence, destabilization, and the fact that some vessels were retreating does not remove the threat. They had already engaged in illegal trafficking and could have reached US waters within hours. So, therefore, these strikes are consistent with preemptive self defense, which is recognized, though carefully constrained, principle of international law. He also argues that these attacks violate marit- maritime law. Not saying that right. Citing the principle that force must be used as a last resort, but the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea permits, in quote, interdiction of vessels engaged in illicit activities, which includes trafficking. So the US did not act arbitrarily. These vessels were part of a documented, ongoing drug trafficking operation that was monitored by international law enforcement. So attempts at interception or boarding in previous cases had failed and posed excessive risk to law enforcement personnel. So, when a vessel poses a continuing threat and prior peaceful measures are insufficient or impractical, targeted use of force is lawful under international law. This is not about attacking innocent fishing boats. These were confirmed trafficking vessels, making the U.S. actions legally defensible. So he also suggests violations of international humanitarian law, because some individuals died without due process. The crucial it's crucial to differentiate between armed conflict scenarios and law enforcement against criminal trafficking. So international humanitarian law uh, primarily governs conduct in armed conflicts, not law enforcement actions against criminal networks. So, under international criminal law, states retain the right to protect themselves from non state actors when those actors are engaged in organized criminal activity that threatens their national security. So, the US military operations targeted combat like actors engaging in this illicit trafficking, not civilians. So, additionally, surviving individuals were captured and turned over to the authorities for prosecution, demonstrating compliance with due process for those who could be detained. He also raised concerns about domestic legal basis, claiming that author- authorizations of force like the 2001 AUMF don't apply. However, domestic law is complementary, not determinative. So, in international law, the legality of self defense under international law does not require Congress to specifically authorize every action, especially when the threat is imminent and evidence shows it endangers national security once again. So, the president, as commander in chief, has authority to act decisively to protect the country. International law recognizes this principle, and states cannot be forced to wait for bureaucratic processes when facing a real ongoing threat. So, finally, regarding his argument that some boats were retreating, this misunderstands how imminent threats are assessed. Threat does not disappear the moment a vessel turns. These boats had already been engaged in illegal activity, and allowing them to escape would perpetuate and harm or risk to the United States. International law permits preventative measures when prior conduct shows a high likelihood of future harm. The strikes were targeted, proportional, and based on credible intelligence, satisfying the requirements of legality. So, in conclusion, while he frames these strikes as arbitrary and unlawful, a real analysis of self-defense principles, um, maritime law, not saying that right, and international humanitarian standards demonstrates otherwise. The US acted to neutralize a documented imminent threat, employed force as a measured response when other means were insufficient, and complied with obligations to process surviving individuals through legal channels that they could at the time. And these attacks were consistent with international law, making them both lawful and justified.